Hello there! Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. We are nearing the end of our journey through Act 1, Defining Directing, where we have been getting acquainted with the FLAME paradigm, made up of F for facilitation/translation, L for leadership, A, artistic insight and taste, and now M, management. If this is your first encounter with Deconstructing Directing, you can learn more about it either in the video description if you're watching this directly on YouTube, or via the library tab if you're watching this on our website. Along with this video, there are links to the PDF transcript and the podcast version of this content below, along with a few worksheets and other resources that you might find helpful in your journey as a director. Without further ado, let's jump into management. Let's start by addressing a significant role division that is going to vary greatly among upstream theater spaces and perhaps even among downstream theater spaces. The division of responsibilities between the producer, production manager, and director, and perhaps even the stage manager. For example, in many educational theater spaces, especially middle and high school spaces with lower funding, the sole theater teacher fills all of the above roles except perhaps stage manager. So which responsibilities are part of which role is somewhat of an academic question. The reality is that they do all of them. Similarly, in some community theater spaces, the director fills most of those roles as well, if not all of them. But in others, there may be a liaison to the board of directors, a dedicated producer, a dedicated production manager or technical director, and or a stage manager. It can vary immensely from theater to theater, and sometimes even show to show within a given theater. Downstream theaters tend to have a bit more structure, but even then it can vary greatly. If the artistic director is the only leader of the organization, meaning that there isn't a managing director, then if they are directing a show, then they are often both the producer and the director. If a guest director is directing under them, then they often serve as the producer for that director. If there is a managing director, they may fill some of the producer duties, and or there may be a production manager or company manager regardless of whether there is a managing director. And in particularly large productions with large budgets, like on Broadway, there may even be associate and assistant directors who help fill some of the managerial responsibilities. If you've been moving through the Act 1 content in order, you may know exactly what I'm about to say. This is why we can't rely on assumptions. So many problematic and frustrating situations in production can be mitigated and sometimes even completely avoided by having explicit conversations up front about responsibilities. Which, of course, means that we have to know what managerial responsibilities there are that need to be defined. So, let's start there. First, let's talk about the difference between facilitation, leadership, and management as we refer to them in this FLAME paradigm. This may be a bit of a review if you've watched the other scenes in this act, so I'll keep it brief. They are all related, to be sure, but the easiest way to think about the differences are that in this context, facilitation refers to how we help support the working relationships between the people on the project. Leadership refers to how we advocate for ourselves, the team, and the project. And management is the nuts and bolts of organization and structure. So, what all does that include? Well, we've provided a worksheet in the usual spot, on the scene page or linked below if you watch this on YouTube, to help you think through exactly that. There will always be slight differences between the organization and structure needed for each project, so it can be a helpful tool to guide you in your preparation. However, it wouldn't be a very helpful video if I just said, go do it yourself. So, here's my breakdown of managerial responsibilities that I think are pretty universal. I'll break it down into pre-production, rehearsals, performances, and post-production. In pre-production, managerial tasks often include show selection, obtaining performance rights, reserving rehearsal and performance space, budget creation and fundraising, publicizing auditions, scheduling and then running auditions and possibly callbacks, recruiting a production team, designers, stage managers, intimacy and fight directors, etc., defining roles and responsibilities, casting and notifying actors, both selected and non, creating a rehearsal schedule and addressing actor conflicts, setting production deadlines. In the rehearsal period, managerial tasks often include structuring rehearsals, selecting communication channels for the cast and crew, communication with the cast and crew, rescheduling or modifying the rehearsal schedule as needed, scheduling and running production meetings, planning for tech and dress rehearsals, marketing design and implementation, program design, and planning for strike and post-production. In the performance period, managerial tasks may often include marketing implementation. In the performance period, managerial tasks may often include marketing implementation. No, let's try that all again. In the performance period, managerial tasks often include marketing implementation, navigating ticketing issues, handling cast or crew illness or emergency conflicts, monitoring consistency, making decisions around logistical issues like severe weather, bad traffic, etc., planning for strike and post-production. And in the post-production period, managerial tasks often include financial closeout, so paying people, balancing the books, etc., strike and logistical management, what's getting saved, where's it going, etc., and debriefs or some other form of feedback process for the cast and crew. Now, there are probably things that I'm forgetting, but I think that this is a solid starting list. As a director who has self-produced most of my own work over 20 years, I've either been directly responsible for or have had oversight of each and every one of these items at various points throughout my career, but not all of them on every show. For instance, often when I work for other producing organizations, I'm not involved in show selection. They offer me a chance to direct a particular show. However, there have been instances where the theater solicits submissions from directors about which shows they want to direct, and that is how they select their seasons. Likewise, sometimes I'm told that I have a particular budget amount, while in other situations the budget is dependent on how much I can raise. Now, this very long list of responsibilities can feel very overwhelming to directors who are a one-person production team, like in many educational theater spaces. I am in no way trying to suggest that a director should be responsible for all of these things, but the reality is that we are often assumed to be the one who will do many of these tasks, especially in upstream spaces. And if we're used to working in that environment and then move into an environment where most of these tasks are actually given to other people, like a producer or a production manager, it can feel like we're losing a lot of input and control, especially if the lines of communication are not open. For instance, I care very deeply about how shows I'm directing are marketed, and I've learned that I often need to ask to be involved in those conversations when I'm not self-producing, since I'm not the one ultimately responsible for the marketing, design, or implementation. This is also why I think it's so important to recognize that the vast majority of our role as directors isn't about the artistic choices we are making. 4 of the 5 aspects of the flame paradigm are not directly related to our artistic choices, though those choices can have an impact on how we fill our other responsibilities. For those that are attracted to directing because of the artistic opportunities, this might feel disappointing, while for those who are nervous about having an artistic vision, this may actually make directing less intimidating because in many ways, it's just a form of people and project management first and foremost. We'll explore all of this in more detail in future acts, but let me offer this perspective. The theater world needs more directors from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, and that means we need you who are listening to or reading this. Nobody, and I mean nobody, will start directing and be proficient at all of this. Heck, I've been directing for nearly 20 years, and there are still things that I'm working on and growing into as a director. I'm sharing this not because I'm a perfect example, but because I'm not. I'm someone who has had to work their tail off to get better because I care deeply about the work and the people I get to work with, and I want to bring my best for them. These tools are here to help you do that work. These tools are here to help you do that work slowly and surely over your directing career, not an expectation that you will all of a sudden have it down after watching these videos and never make mistakes. The imperfections and mistakes are where growth happens, if we can acknowledge them and work on ourselves to avoid making that same mistake again. Okay, done with the pep talk for now. But don't forget that you matter, regardless of your experience with directing. So let's close out this video on management by talking about organizational structures and techniques that might be helpful. Each of these has something different to offer, and none are better or worse in a vacuum. Their effectiveness will change depending on who is using them and how they are implemented. So feel free to experiment with different models on different projects and find what works best for you and your teams. We're going to explore 5 management models: work breakdown structure, Kanban boards, scrums, Gantt charts, and PERT, P-E-R-T, though there are plenty more out there. There's a set of worksheets below that gives you an overview of each of these and how you might use them. Let's start with work breakdown structure. This is a very basic tool on which many other project management techniques are based, but can be very helpful when you're first starting a project to identify specific tasks that are necessary. It uses a tiered structure that essentially breaks down each objective into dependencies, or smaller tasks that are needed to complete the primary objective. Let's use the example of our objective being create a rehearsal schedule. That objective is valid, but I can't accomplish that in one step. So there are dependencies, namely that I need to A, determine the amount of rehearsal time needed, and B, determine when rehearsal space is available. In order to determine the amount of rehearsal time needed, I might have another layer of dependencies, such as create scene breakdown by number of pages, or determine how many pages can be addressed in an hour, and determine length of individual rehearsals. Those are 3 tasks that don't really have any dependencies, assuming I already have a copy of the script. Likewise, if we go back to determine when rehearsal space is available, I might have sub-dependencies of call rehearsal space to get availability, or overlay availability calendar on rehearsal period calendar. The goal when using work breakdown structure is to get to a level of tasks that can be completed without any other dependencies, and then work up the chain from there. Note that this tool is most effective for understanding exactly what tasks must be accomplished, but not necessarily helpful for creating a project schedule or timeline. The next tool we'll discuss is the Kanban board structure, and it's one you might be familiar with if you've used tools like Trello or Microsoft 365's Planner function. It originates from the realm of manufacturing and comes from the Japanese words kan, meaning sign, and ban, meaning board. It uses a visual representation of tasks that are organized into different buckets, often represented by columns. The simplest structure is 3 columns, marked to do, in progress, and done. By placing individual tasks onto the board, all members of the team can be aware of everything that needs to be done or is in progress, and thus help to ensure nothing gets dropped or lost. As tasks move across the board to done, new tasks may need to be created or added to the to-do list, creating a regular flow of tasks across the board. Using a process like work breakdown structure might be helpful to understand what tasks need to be completed first, whereas a Kanban board is more about the team understanding the progress of the overall project. Kanban boards can even be strung together. Perhaps the costume team has one Kanban board, and as they move into the final column, those tasks then get moved to the production Kanban board to be approved or something else done with them. And you can create as many columns as you want, maybe a different column for each production team member or department's in progress list, and you can also color code the tasks to relate to different folks on the team. The third tool, Scrum, is closely related to Kanban and will often use that structure. Scrum comes out of the field of software development, where a team of developers are developing, say, an app together and often have to be flexible and responsive to changing parameters or requirements of the project owner. Scrum is most known for its sprint mechanic, a dedicated period of time of focused work on narrowly defined tasks to reach a collectively decided outcome. There are basically 3 stages to a sprint: the planning, daily scrums, and a review. In the software development world, a sprint might be a week or 2 weeks of daily work, but in theater, the time might be longer or shorter depending on the goals and capabilities of the team. The planning for a sprint is a collaborative process, with every member of the team that is engaging in the sprint part of deciding what are reasonable goals to accomplish in that amount of time. Once those goals are set and the sprint begins, scrums, for which this technique is named, come into play. Now, if you're a rugby fan, you may recognize the word scrum or scrummage, which is a play when the forwards of both teams come together in a tight formation and struggle to gain possession of the ball. While in a project management context, scrums are collaborative rather than competitive, the similarities are notable. A scrum in this context is essentially a team meeting, the start of the day, ideally no longer than 15 minutes in length, and it's intended to help get everyone on the same page and thus allow them to work individually and reduce the need for more meetings throughout the day. In a theater context, scrums might happen weekly if your sprint period is longer, or more frequently if you're condensing the sprint for, say, a long tech day. Perhaps the most important part of any sprint, though, is the review or retrospective at the end, when team members are invited to debrief the sprint and identify what went well and what can and needs to be improved before the next sprint. The 4th tool we'll discuss is one that is specifically designed to help understand the timeline of a project, called a Gantt chart. The name comes from Henry Gantt, an engineer and project manager who customized and popularized it. But the idea was originally created by Karol Adabiecki, I don't know how you pronounce that exactly, a Polish engineer in the 1890s. A Gantt chart is a specific form of bar chart where tasks are represented on the Y, or vertical axis, and timeline is represented on the X, or horizontal axis. Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets are excellent tools for creating Gantt charts for this reason. Each task is represented on a separate line, with the starting points and due dates represented by a bar that spans them. Like with the work breakdown structure, this can be a very helpful tool for understanding both the time needed to complete different tasks, but also what tasks are dependent on others being completed. One of the most effective ways I've used Gantt charts is to work backwards. If you know what date the production must open by, then you can work backwards to understand when various tasks must be completed. Don't be afraid to use other tools like the work breakdown structure to help craft specific tasks and understand dependencies as you create your Gantt chart timeline. The 5th and final tool we'll discuss is PERT, or the Program Evaluation and Review Technique. This is another tool that can be helpful in estimating timelines for project components. It's a slightly more advanced version of a Gantt chart in that sense, and was developed by the US Navy in the 1950s. When using PERT, you start by identifying the tasks that need to be completed and 3 different estimates for the time each task will take: an optimistic estimate, a pessimistic estimate, and the most likely time. The final time you assign to each task is reached using a weighted average, where the optimistic estimate is represented by the variable O, the pessimistic estimate is represented by the variable P, and 4 times the most likely estimate, represented by 4 times the variable M, are added together and the total divided by 6. You can then use additional equations to account for standard deviations in time and the likelihood that things will go wrong. These times can then be put into a Gantt chart, or what's called a network diagram, that demonstrates dependencies and the variable times expected of each task. Once you've done this, you can then identify the critical path, or the elements of your project that have no slack or can't be delayed, along with elements that could be delayed up to a certain amount without delaying the project. This helps with prioritizing when things go wrong and understanding what needs to be completed first. This is perhaps the most technical of all the tools because of the math involved, so we've included some additional links below to help you learn more about it if you are interested. Now, these 5 tools, when combined with a focus on explicitly defining the roles and responsibilities of everyone involved in a production, rather than just relying on assumptions, can be immensely helpful in getting down to the nuts and bolts of what tasks need to be accomplished and how they can be approached. The thread through all of them, however, is a need for regular communication with your team. Even directors in educational theater spaces can and should involve their students in understanding exactly what goes into the production of a theatrical work, even if you don't feel like you can hand off full responsibilities to those students just yet. So with that, we'll wrap up our introduction to management as a part of defining directing. We'll return to these concepts in later acts as we dive into that task list we discussed above and break down process design, marketing, and more. Hopefully this was a helpful introduction to this aspect of a director's role and will give you enough food for thought and tools to try out until we get to those acts. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. It's hard to believe it, but we just have one letter left in our flame paradigm, E for education/mentoring. I'll see you there, my fellow flames.